Hi. The commodity that I chose for my project was crude oil. If you don't already know what crude oil is, I will give you a little background information on it right now before we dive deeper into the project. Crude oil is also known as petroleum or just oil. It is a yellowish black liquid found in geological formations beneath the Earth's surface. It can be refined to produce usable products such as gasoline and diesel and many more household products that you're probably not even aware that come from crude oil. It is a non-renewable resource, which means that it can't be replaced naturally at the rate we consume it, and it is therefore a limited resource, which means maybe someday in the future crude oil will run out, but that is uncertain at this time. Many economists argue that it is the most important commodity in the world. Some more facts about crude oil that may help you better understand my commodity are oil is measured in barrels, which one barrel is equal to 42 US gallons or 159 liters. The US consumes more oil than any other country. When crude oil goes to be refined, 45% of it is made into gasoline products. In the past 25 years, there have been more than 2 dozen oil spills in the US, and as I'm sure many of you know, crude oil spills and oil spills are very, very bad for the environment, so we're constantly working on ways to avoid those. And last, ancient cultures used crude oil as a substance for binding materials and as a sealant for waterproofing various surfaces. So it's not a new commodity that has just been invented or discovered in the last couple of years. It's been around for a long time. As I'm sure you may already know, crude oil has to be extracted from the earth, but I will give you some more information on how this is done. The first step involves preparing the rig site, which consists of concrete pads and access roads that you will be using to bring in the different materials needed for drilling the oil out. Next, a well is drilled straight down in the ground beneath the pad. Once the target distance of the well is reached, the drill pipe is removed and steel pipe is pushed to the bottom. The well casing is then cemented in place. Next, a perforating gun is lowered into the ground and fired into the rock layer, creating holes that connect the rock holding the oil and natural gas in the wellhead. Now that the first stage of the well is open, you must unlock the oil and natural gas that is trapped in the rock. Using specialized instruments to monitor pressure and data from the well in real time, fluid fracking is pumped at high pressure throughout the perforating holes to create cracks, freeing the oil and natural gas trapped inside. Once fracking is complete, production begins. Oil and natural gas flow up from the wellbore and fracking fluid is then recycled. Because as you know, oil and water don't mix, so you'll be able to separate them out and recycle the fracturing fluid. When all the recovered oil and natural gas has been produced, the well must be permanently plugged and the land returned to the way it was before the drilling operation started. And if all goes to plan, the land that the well was drilled on you shouldn't even be able to tell that there was a well drilled on it. On this slide, you will see a timeline that shows the important events that have happened over the history of crude oil. And I took it back to like the last 10 years, basically. In 2008, there was an oil shock. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 created uncertainty about the future supply of oil. And at the time, Asian demand increased massively, contributing to a rise from $20 in 2000 to over $140 in 2008. So the price of crude oil went through the roof, basically. In 2008, we also experienced a financial crisis, though. From there, prices fell and rebounded as a result of the global financial crisis, which created shortages of oil and the high prices that they were experiencing earlier in the year were completely gone. The price of oil had just fell through the floor. In 2015, there was a shale oil production, and there was new U.S. production of shale oil, and it increased the global oil supply. In 2016, there was an addition to supply from 2015, and it drove down the global oil prices. So more people were supplying it, and it made the prices fall for the people trying to sell oil. And then this year, 2020, the COVID pandemic began around January roughly, and governments began restricting travel and closing businesses due to the coronavirus pandemic and trying to keep everything under control. But because of this, the demand for oil began falling and has been pretty continuously falling since, and the prices have been falling as well. This graph includes the 30 days prior to November 17th. Overall, the price trends of crude oil have fluctuated a lot in the last 30 days. So you can notice that the first half of the 30 days is kind of steadily decreasing. You do have some increases in there, but generally decreasing. And then the second half of the 30 days is generally increasing, but with a few decreases in there as well. On 10/19/2020, which was the first day of the 30-day trend, the price of crude oil was $40.69 per barrel. The lowest price reached during these 30 days was on 10/30/2020, and it was $35.21. And you can see that down here at the bottom. Right there is where we met that point. The largest percent change is from 10/29 to 10/30, and it was a 12.45% decrease. This next graph shows the price trends of crude oil over the last 5 years. As you can see, the lowest price crude oil has reached in the last 5 years was April of 2020, and the price was $18.84 a barrel. You can see that on the graph right there. This significant price drop was due to the pandemic that we were experiencing and still experiencing. The highest price oil has reached in the last 5 years was $74.15 per barrel on June 2018. A refinery is a facility where raw materials, in this case crude oil, are converted into some valuable substance by having the impurities removed from it. Crude oil is sent to refineries where it is then turned into usable products such as gasoline, diesel, and aviation fluids. Plastics are also made from oil. Crude oil can be turned into feedstock, which is used in petrochemical plants and turned into plastic to make essential products for our everyday lives. More than 6,000 everyday products begin with oil, including dishwashing liquids, solar panels, food preservatives, eyeglasses, DVDs, children's toys, and tires. Next, I will tell you about the different companies that are involved in the supply of crude oil. National oil companies operate as extensions of a government or government agency. China Petroleum and Chemical is a producer and distributor of a variety of petrochemical and petroleum products. Products include gasoline, diesel, kerosene, synthetic rubbers and resins, jet fuel, and other related offerings. It is the largest oil refining, gas, and petrochemical company in the world. PetroChina is engaged in oil products exploration, development, production, and sales. And then lastly would be the Saudi Arabian Oil Company for the national oil companies. And then we move on to international oil companies, and they are entirely investor owned and are primarily invested in increasing value for their shareholders. Some of the international oil companies would be ExxonMobil, BP, and Royal Dutch Shell. IOCs tend to make investment decisions based on economic factors. International oil companies typically move quickly to develop and product the oil resources available to them and sell their output in the global market. The companies involved in the demand of crude oil you may recognize from the previous slide: ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco. You may question why the same companies are supplying oil as is the companies that are demanding oil, and that is because there are so many different types and kinds of crude oil. The following countries are those that import crude oil: Canada, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Ecuador, and Iraq. As of August 2020, Canada imported 3.4 million barrels per day. Mexico imported 645,000 barrels per day. Saudi Arabia imported 267,000 barrels per day. Ecuador 231,000, and Iraq 209,000 barrels per day. Again, you will recognize many of these countries that export crude oil are also those that import crude oil, and it's the same reason as I said before. It's because there are so many different types of crude oil. The top 5 countries that exported the highest dollar value worth of crude oil are Saudi Arabia, number 1, with $133.6 billion, which was 13.3% of the exported crude oil. Russia, exporting $121.4 billion, which was 12.2% of the exported crude oil. Iraq, which exported $83.3 billion. Canada, who exported $668.1 billion, and the United Arab Emirates, and they exported $66.1 billion. The future of crude oil can seem a bit uncertain to me. Personally, if I were trying to decide whether or not to invest in crude oil, I would not invest in stocks of crude oil. And my reasoning behind that is there are currently 1.6 trillion barrels of oil globally in the reserves, and it is believed that the oil reserves will be exhausted sometime between 2050 and 2060. And if you remember back at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned how this source is not, there won't always be crude oil. It can get used up. So as time goes on, it is also expected that global consumption of crude oil will increase, and that will shorten the expectancy of the amount of years that we have left with crude oil on this earth. So personally, I would not invest in stocks of crude oil just for that being my reasoning. This last page is the different websites and resources that I use to help gather my materials needed for this presentation. Thank you for listening.